be here. I love talking about what I do, so we'll get to kind of ride through that this morning. Let me anticipate where we're going to go and kind of what my idea is behind what we're going to be talking about this morning. So I'd like to think about the future and think about, okay, if you're going to invent the future, what would it look like? And to me, the way the future would look like with regard to suicide is that we would be able to anticipate who is likely to become suicidal in the future and to be able to intervene with those people before they ever become ill in the first place. That's really the objective here. We now have the tools to be able to do that, to be able to intervene, and I'll talk a little bit about that when we get toward the end. But I want to also kind of do the background behind this with regard to how can you predict, how can we anticipate what's likely to happen in the future. Because really the future of medicine is in an area that I'm going to be talking about today called predictive analytics. It's kind of a fancy term for being able to use information from the past to be able to predict what's likely to happen in the future. And that's really where we're going with the research program that we have going currently at UAB. Now let me just kind of set this up briefly for us and talk about suicide in Alabama. This came from AFSP. As you can see, there are a lot of folks who commit suicide in Alabama, as we can see right here. Over 700 people a year are known to complete suicide. We know that, based on national statistics, that there probably is easily twice that number of actual suicides every year. So somewhere approaching 1,500 people a year die. We also know that there are close to 18,000 suicide attempts in Alabama every year. And of those attempts, each one will cost a certain amount of resources. And we also know that more than 3,000 people out of that number of people who attempt suicide will become permanently disabled as a result of their suicide attempt. And with a lifetime cost of $75 million for each person who makes a suicide attempt. Suicide is, oops, let me back up here. Suicide is the second leading cause of death amongst children, adolescents, and young adults after accidents. And there are twice as many suicides, twice as many known suicides every year as there are homicides in the state of Alabama. And think of what a big deal homicide is, people committing murder. Well, for every homicide that you hear about on television, there have been 2 suicides for each one of those that you see. This is obviously an enormous public health problem, very expensive public health problem in Tennessee, and I would again refer you to the AFSP site that will give you more details about that. The other problem that we have is that suicide, unlike most other major medical conditions, suicide frequency is actually going up in the U.S. It's actually increased by about 24% since 1999. And there are a lot of reasons for why that's the case. But the reality is that as far as people actually committing suicide, we've been losing ground for the last 2 decades, which means that we really have to think about dealing with the problem of suicide in sort of a different way. Now, I would like to set it up in this way. So if we're going to be able to deal effectively with the problem of suicide, all of these statements have to be true, right, simultaneously. So all these if-then statements. So if people with depression and suicide are identified, and if they get to treatment, and the treatment is done properly, and they stick with the treatment, we know, based on data that we generated in our research program, more than 80% of people can get to sustained recovery, more than 90% of people will improve. Now look at those top 4 statements. What problem do you see in those top 4 statements? Huh? Just think about that for just a second. If people with depression and who are suicidal are identified, if they get to treatment, if the treatment is done properly, and if they stick with treatment. That's right. They're all ifs, right? All 4 of those things have to be true. We know very often all 4 of those things are not true, right? And I'm going to be anticipating with you really how we're going to be able to push the field forward. We think that we can push the field forward in order to make things better. I'm also going to close today with a short discussion of things that we know are effective for either preventing or reversing suicidal thinking or behavior. So that's really where we're anticipating going, okay? And the reality is that's very often, these four statements are very often not true. These are data from a friend of mine, Dr. Andy Leon at Cornell University in New York City. And what Andy did was to look at suicides over a 3-year period of time that came to the medical examiner's office in New York. And what he found was, in New York City, only about 1 in 4 people were in treatment at the time that they committed suicide. Now, I don't know about you, but the fact is, my thought about New York City is you can't throw a rock without hitting a psychiatrist in New York, right? So there's lots of mental health services available in New York City. Think about taking these same statistics and moving them anywhere else in the country where the availability of mental health services is going to be significantly less. What it means basically is not enough people get the treatment that they need. And so we have to be able to figure out how to solve that problem in a way that gets more people to treatment before they make their suicide attempt. Okay, so let's talk about a path to suicide. If we're going to talk about the fundamental neurobiology of suicide, we know several things. And that is that suicide very often follows a specific pathway, if that makes sense. So we can begin with severe mental disorders like depression, but also schizophrenia, substance abuse problems, bipolar disorder. We couple that with an environmental stress, which leads to sort of a sense of hopelessness. And then we couple that with impulsivity, and we have one path to suicide. Now, I'm going to show you in just a little bit that this is only one path. There actually are probably multiple paths to suicide, but this is one very common one, and one where actually the underlying biology of suicide is fairly well understood, at least at the macro level, and I'll explain this as we go along. The other thing that we know is that a serious mental illness is not required. So a person can have a stressful event occur in their life, and they may impulsively go and make a suicide attempt, or may actually complete suicide. And so we really kind of formulate that really impulsivity is sort of a fundamental problem with regard to risk for suicide in some people, not in everyone. I'm sure that folks in the room know of people in this state who've made impulsive suicide attempts. They break up, with their girlfriend or boyfriend, or they go through a divorce or things like that, and they impulsively go and commit suicide. But that's only one path. Contrast that to the person who carefully plans, writes a note, gets all their financial affairs in order. That's a very different path to suicide, and we have to be able to account for all of that. But I'm going to talk briefly just about the impulsivity component of this. And to do that, we have to talk about the serotonin system. Most people in the room, I'm sure, are familiar with serotonin. You know that many antidepressant medications, Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, those sorts of medicines act on the serotonin system. And we know that the serotonin system is involved in at least that subtype of suicide that's associated with impulsivity. This actually shows you the distribution of serotonin-containing neurons or nerve cells in the brain. They start out in the base part of the brain, the sort of bottom area of the brain, and they distribute all through the brain, and they have an important role in controlling or regulating brain function. Their primary role is actually inhibitory. So serotonin distributes to the brain and functions to inhibit brain activity. There we go. And so we've known actually for more than 2 decades now that serotonin is involved in suicide, at least that impulsive form of suicide. So, for example, people who commit suicide have fewer serotonin neurons in the brain. Serotonin and its main metabolite are lower in people who make suicide attempts, and the more lethal the suicide attempt is, the lower the brain serotonin tends to be. So if a person makes a suicide attempt by jumping off a building or by shooting themselves or some sort of violent way like that, they have lower serotonin activity. And lower serotonin activity is associated with more impulsive attempts. So breakup suicide, right? So that has been well understood and well described. Now, as I'm going to anticipate with you, however, that tells us the what, but not the why. Okay, we're going to come back to the why here in just a minute, but this tells you that at least for one version of suicide, the fundamental neurobiology is reasonably well understood. So as I mentioned to you, serotonin is mainly inhibitory in the nervous system. And an important area affected by serotonin is the frontal cortex. Now, the frontal part of the brain up here, if we back up, it's the part here on the far left side. This won't back up any further. There we go. Part on the far left side of that graphic of the brain, the frontal cortex, that's the part that you're using to think about what I'm talking about, or thinking about lunch, or thinking about, thinking about what you have to do when you go home. That's that part. It's also the judgment and decision-making part of the brain. And serotonin is, to a significant degree, involved in inhibitory function in that decision-making part of the brain. Think about it this way. So I was driving up here or down here from Birmingham this morning, and you ever get that impulse that you just want to ram your car into the car in front of you? You're sitting in traffic and you want to do that. I know that happens to no one in the room, but it happens to me. I just want to ram it. Well, fortunately, for most of us, most of the time, that doesn't happen, right? So that's a good thing, probably. You get irritated with somebody, you don't whack them most of the time. And that's a good and a positive thing. Well, that means that your serotonin system is intact and it has its proper inhibitory role. It keeps you from taking that action. Folks who have a high level of impulsivity seem to have lost that capacity. And the way this works is actually this way. So serotonin, coming up from that basal part of the brain, connects with what are referred to as interneurons. That's interneurons, exactly what it sounds like. It's a neuron between neurons. And that releases a chemical called GABA. By the way, that's like natural Valium or Xanax. It's a naturally occurring substance in the brain. And it functions to inhibit the activity of those neurons or nerve cells in the brain and keep you from ramming your car into the people in front of you, right? Bang. Well, okay, if that doesn't work, what happens? This is not a rhetorical question. I'm sorry? You're going to ram your car, right? You're going to do that. Or if you happen to have a suicidal thought, you may be more likely to act on it. And so that inhibitory function is really a critical role in the brain. And serotonin mostly functions in the brain to do exactly that. It also reduces distress or anxiety, which is one of the reasons why the so-called SSRI, antidepressant medications, work. And I'm going to be lecturing my residents on that this afternoon, kind of teaching them about how that functions. But actually, as you can see, this is known at a fairly detailed level. We understand this function, at least for one major subtype of suicide. So suicidal behavior seems to be related to serotonin activity, but serotonin deficits predispose to impulsivity, not simply to suicide. So again, it determines one path to suicide, but not all possible paths to suicide. Number two is this tells us what happens at the high level. To me, high level is at the whole cell level, right? But doesn't tell us what's happening at the micro level, what's happening within cells to cause people to be vulnerable. So it tells us the what, but not the why. And as I mentioned to you already, it only tells us about one form of suicide. Now, this has been a sticky problem, and the field sort of got stuck here for a number of years. So the field was really sort of trapped with, okay, we understand the what, but we can't drill below this and get to the why. Now I want to talk with you about the why, and the why will actually help us to anticipate, we think will help us to anticipate who's likely to be vulnerable in the future, okay? All right, so first of all, let's talk about suicide phenotypes. So when we talk about, I'm going to be talking about genetics in just a minute, but a phenotype is basically how the genetic makeup actually influences what happens in the body, like thinking behavior, things of that sort. And based on our own data generated at UAB, I just analyzed the data about a month ago, we've been able to define 5 separate versions of suicide. So remember, we have the one version that's involved with impulsivity. Well, that's only one of 5 types. And the idea here is what we want to do is take the genetic information and divide people into these groups so we can understand at a basic biological level what's causing the individual problem. So we take the spectrum of suicide, which is not just one thing, and we break it out into its component parts, and to be able to figure out what the underlying biology is. The suicide phenotypes fall out into these 5 categories. And please understand, it's not that all 5 of these characteristics are true for a given individual, but given individuals fall into one of these 5 groups. Because we know that there is a subtype of suicide that's associated with irritability and anger. Have you ever met a suicidal person who seemed to be really angry all the time, right? That's one type. A second is an inattentive type. It's not the same as being impulsive. So there are people who have attention problems who also appear to be vulnerable to suicide. There's an impulsive type, as I already mentioned to you. We have another type that's associated with emotional instability. That is emotions that are just all over the map all the time. And then the last type is a mistrust, sort of paranoid subtype. It's not paranoid delusions, but certainly fears or worries about other people. Those represent 5 distinct subtypes. And when we go through the process of being able to figure out the underlying genetics of suicide, this is kind of the framework that we're using right now. And so we can see that those 5 subtypes exist. Now, I'm going to be talking about treatment a little bit later. We also think that these subtypes may map onto treatment response and give you one example of that. So the one example that I'll talk about before we finish today is lithium treatment. So lithium is used to treat bipolar disorder, as everybody knows. But the truth is lithium also reduces risk for suicide. It's actually been shown to have a pretty dramatic anti-suicide benefit. So if I have a suicidal person with bipolar disorder, then I'm going to generally try to treat them with lithium if I possibly can. Well, we think that it probably applies mostly to the impulsive type of suicide. We're actually generating data to try to figure that out right now. But lithium may not be helpful for every possible type of suicide. It may be responsible for a particular subtype of impulsive suicidal behavior. So that what it does is it puts a lag period between when the person has the impulse and when they actually take the action of committing suicide. And that lag, we think, is what keeps people from committing suicide when they're on lithium. So we'll talk about that more as we go along. So we're dealing with these fundamental suicide phenotypes. Now let's talk about the genetics of suicide, okay? So is suicide genetic? And the answer to that is yes, but. Okay, like many things in genetics these days, it's yes, but. It's not genetics in the way we typically think of genetics. You know genetics, people probably, I'm sure everybody's familiar. You have genes in your DNA. Those genes code for messenger RNAs and proteins. Those genes can have variations associated with them. Well, the truth is that relatively few diseases are explained by abnormalities of the sequence of genes. It's just a fact. They just are not. Complex diseases like hypertension, type 2 diabetes, things of that sort, are not well explained by classical genetics. And one of the reasons for that is only 1.5% of human DNA is in the form of genes. 98.5% of your DNA has nothing to do with genes. It doesn't code for proteins at all. And we also know that the environment influences behavior and influences the genetics of your behavior, right, in a very important way. For example, a person who's been abused sexually as a child has between a 10-14-fold increased risk for suicide later in life. Well, that's in effect that the environment has had that impacts the DNA, the genetic material that we have, but not in the way that we typically think of. The fact is, the environment can induce permanent changes in DNA, and we'll talk about that as we go along, okay? So the question is, how does this work? Okay, well, so we have this segment of DNA, and by the way, this is work done with my collaborator, Dr. Yogesh Dwivedi. Yogesh is up in the corner there. So, and this is, I'm the clinical guy, he's the laboratory guy. We can at least talk the same language, which is good. But Yogesh has been able to do some very nice work on something that is a relatively new concept in the world of genetics. So think about your DNA and think about genes, right? Little segments of DNA in the form of genes. Those genes code for messenger RNAs and proteins. And for, a half a century, this is really the mechanism by which we have understood genetic information in the body, right? But we have all this stuff in between. And for a long time, people just thought that was genetic junk, I mean, seriously, that's a term that people would use, that it's DNA that really doesn't do anything. Well, we actually know that that's not true now, and that DNA in between is actually probably much more important than the DNA in the form of those genes that code for proteins. For example, there are little short segments of RNA that are coded by the DNA in between genes, and one of the types are microRNAs, and it's exactly what it sounds like. A microRNA is a very, very short sequence or segment of RNA that controls or regulates the function of other RNAs and proteins. Now, that's complicated, but hang in with me for just a minute. I'll explain what I'm talking about, okay? But you think about the impact of the environment on how your body functions, this is one of the critical roles, one of the critical components of genetics that controls that. So this is the way I tend to think about it. What I'm showing you here is a nuclear reactor. It's actually the control room of a nuclear reactor, right? And think about a control room of a nuclear reactor. It's got all kinds of switches and dials and buttons and all kinds of things, right, that control or regulate the reactor. Well, that's what these little short segments of RNA do. They're actually like the switches within the cell that turn things on and turn things off. They themselves can be turned on or turned off, and sometimes they can be turned on or turned off permanently. So you have this kind of regulatory function within the cell that is the critical way in which the environment influences what's going on within the cells in your body. Does that make sense? Everybody with me? Okay. So this is really kind of the control system for the cell. Actually much more important than the proteins that we typically think of as being the control system. Proteins are more the results than the cause. In addition to that, those little short segments of RNA can be packaged up into little vesicles called exosomes, can be packaged up into vesicles and released out of cells. And that can affect other cells around your individual cells, but it can also go into the bloodstream and be distributed all throughout the body and affect other kinds of cells or tissues in the body, right? So what's happening in one organ affects another. Let me give you an example of that. You can get the flu, right? It's inflammation in your lung. It affects your whole body, right? It's going to affect your whole body. Your whole body is actually going to become inflamed as a result of being the flu, and you're going to be laying in the bed for a week or so. By the way, get your flu shot. So we want to avoid that. But one of the ways that happens is that cells release these little packages of these switches or dials into the system that get absorbed into other tissues and influence how they function. Now, why is that important? Well, partly because it actually leads us to a better understanding of what's going on at the cellular level, subcellular level that we talked about before, and gives us ways of targeting specific segments of the DNA in order to be able to either treat or prevent problems from happening in the first place. But my collaborator, Dr. Drovetti, has developed a method in the lab where we can actually take a blood sample and he can isolate the little packages or vesicles of microRNAs that come directly out of brain. So we can do a blood test to be able to determine levels of microRNAs in brain. And what we can do with that is we can take that and to develop patterns by doing analysis of those little segments of DNA. And those patterns identify people who have attempted suicide, people who are thinking about suicide, and distinguish that from folks who are depressed and not suicidal and from controls. We already have data showing that we can establish patterns that will help us to anticipate who's likely to become suicidal in the future. Right? And so by doing that, by doing a simple blood test, we can we can actually predict what the future is. And let me show you how this would work just from a practical standpoint. And again, it goes back to that area of predictive analytics. And probably everybody in the room uses predictive analytics every day. You probably don't know that that's what you're doing, but that's what you're doing. All right? So what's this? Well, what I'm showing you here are pictures of Google data centers around the world. Google has not exactly invented the area of predictive analytics, but they definitely use it probably better than anyone else in the world right now. Right? And let me give you an example of predictive analytics. So you type in Mary had in Google, and what does Google do? It suggests possibilities, right? So Mary had what? A little lamb. Okay, so it anticipates that the next words that you're going to type is a little lamb. It does that because it analyzes billions of keystrokes from hundreds of millions of people every single day, and develops these predictive algorithms to be able to anticipate what your next line is like, what the rest of your line is likely to be. Does that make sense? But it's using past information to predict future behavior. And this is actually a very rapidly emerging area in medicine. For example, UAB has developed a new informatics institute, and predictive analytics in the area of medicine is going to be, is a big component of what the Informatics Institute does, and we're working closely with the folks. And this whole emerging area of bioinformatics and using prior information about individuals to be able to predict what's likely to happen in the future is a growing, and we think in the next 20 years will be the important advances in the area of medicine. Now, if I could do a blood test and anticipate who's likely to commit suicide in the future, how would that be useful? By the way, you notice that I do ask questions and I just wait, right? So I'm a psychiatrist, I can wait a long time. So, all right? How might you use that information? Oh, to get people, to connect people with treatment? Good. Anything else? Okay. So early engagement, meaning before people ever get sick in the first place, right? So we really have two objectives for this. Number one is to be able to identify, when a person shows up for treatment, we want to be able to anticipate who's likely to be at risk for suicide, to be able to give them the treatment that I'm going to talk with you about, treatments that I'm going to talk with you about in just a few minutes. But our ultimate goal is actually well beyond just that. Our ultimate goal is to be able to intervene with kids, right? There exists now today good methods for providing psychological treatment, psychotherapy to children and their families that has already been shown to substantially reduce the risk for depression and suicide. The problem is we just don't know who those kids are yet. I mean, yes, okay, we can figure that if a child has a depressed parent, that's probably a good way of getting started, or if a child has a parent who's made a suicide attempt. But we don't want to have to wait for all of those for that reason that we talked about at the beginning of the talk, right? Because we know that if we wait for them to show up, then we're going to miss a lot of people, a lot of children, a lot of adolescents who are subsequently going to make a suicide attempt. So what we want to be able to do is to use predictive analytics to anticipate the kids who are going to be at highest risk for subsequent suicide, and then be able to take that into intervention programs to target the kids and help target the children and their family to reduce their subsequent risk. We don't have to use drugs. This can be done psychotherapeutically. We know that because of the work that research group that I collaborated with when I was at Vanderbilt, Judy Garber and Bruce Compass, there have been able to show very nicely that you can do family-based cognitive behavioral psychotherapy, and it works to reduce risk for depression and suicide in children. So that's really our ultimate goal here. That's where we're going. And this is really in the area of what's sometimes referred to as big data. So big data solutions. So we can take a lot of different kinds of data, like genetic information and microRNAs and protein analysis and clinical assessments, all that kind of business. So we're anticipating, and what we're working on now are so-called big data analytics solutions to be able to predict, to actually be able to do more precise medical assessment diagnosis, give more precision to diagnosis, to be able to predict who's going to respond to which treatment, and ultimately to be able to intervene and anticipate and prevent people from ever becoming sick in the first place. This is the future of medicine. This is what we're working on today at UAB. Right? Now, if we can figure it out, what can we do with it then? Where can we go with treatment beyond that? If I can get that to move forward. It's not cooperating with me. One more. There we go. Actually, I'm just going to skip that and talk about treatment. Excuse me. So there are four treatments that have been established to be effective to either prevent or reverse suicidal thinking or behavior. I'm going to talk about the 3 prevention treatments, and then I'm going to be talking about brand new data that we've generated at UAB. The first three treatments, clozapine, cognitive behavioral psychotherapy, and its cousins, its derivatives, like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy, and lithium treatment have all been shown to be beneficial in preventing suicide attempts in the future. The first one, clozapine, I'm not going to talk about at any length, but a good friend of mine, Herb Meltzer, did the definitive study on clozapine showing that clozapine, and hopefully everybody knows that clozapine is an antipsychotic medication. Clozapine actually reduces risk for suicide, much more so than other antipsychotic medications do. So if somebody is psychotic and suicidal, in my view, clozapine is the treatment of choice for those folks. Cognitive behavioral psychotherapy and lithium are also quite well established. Let's try to go forward here. All right, we're stuck. There we go. There you go. Good. So this is one example of many studies looking at the beneficial effect of cognitive behavioral psychotherapy. This is looking at military personnel who were suicidal at baseline, and they received either the regular treatment that they would normally receive, referred to here as treatment as usual or TAU, or they received cognitive behavioral psychotherapy in addition to the regular treatment that they were going to receive. And in follow-up, you can see the number of days in follow-up and the number of people who made suicide attempts. And cognitive behavioral psychotherapy reduced the likelihood of somebody making a suicide attempt from about 40% to about 14%. So it really substantially reduced the risk for suicide. And I'm a big fan of cognitive behavioral psychotherapy for prevention of subsequent suicide attempts, because you don't have to use a drug under those circumstances. Many studies have shown basically the same thing. Next slide. In addition to that, I mentioned to you lithium already. This is an analysis done in 2006. So this is a decade ago. And a decade ago, there were already 31 studies showing that lithium treatment reduces risk for suicide, about an 80% reduction in suicide risk. And this is true whether you have bipolar disorder or whether you have garden variety non-bipolar depression. If I have someone in my clinic whether they have bipolar disorder or just regular depression, who is seriously suicidal or has made a serious suicide attempt, lithium is one of the treatments that I try to go to, because I think it's very likely, and we have, our experience with this definitely supports this, that there is a significant reduction in subsequent suicide risk with lithium. We think this is mostly in that impulsive suicide area, but lithium reduces risk quite clearly, many studies showing the same basic thing. The other thing that it's shown is that if a person makes a suicide attempt, they're much less likely to die of that suicide attempt, because they don't use those lethal means as much, shooting themselves, jumping off buildings, things of that sort. And again, bipolar disorder, non-bipolar depression, very clearly established as being effective. All right, next. Now, let me talk about new treatment and work that we've been doing at UAB in collaboration with centers around the country. So anyone heard of ketamine treatment for depression? Anybody heard of that? Hold up your hands, ketamine treatment. Ketamine is an anesthetic medication that's been around since about 1970. My father was an anesthesiologist, and he used it back in the beginning of 1970. At high doses, ketamine can put you to sleep for surgery. A little bit below that level, it can make you really, really high. So ketamine is a potentially abusable drug. But low doses infused very slowly, well below the level that either puts you to sleep or gets you high, very low level of ketamine infused over a 40-minute period produces a very, very rapid antidepressant effect, first shown by my friend Carlos Zarate at the NIH. And as you can see, the effect maximizes out at about 24 hours. So in other words, in about 80% of people who are seriously depressed, we can take them from being depressed to not depressed within a day. I think it's pretty good statistics. That's pretty favorable, pretty exciting stuff. We actually did the first larger scale study of the use of ketamine in an emergency department. And to anticipate this, so suicidal people came to the emergency department at UAB, and they either got ketamine or placebo infusion, and then they went to the inpatient treatment program where their treatment was otherwise adjusted, and then we had 14 days of follow-up. If people got placebo, If they got placebo and they just got regular treatment, their suicidal thinking got better over about a 2-week period of time. Now, the problem with that is that we know that they're only going to stay in the hospital about 5 to 7 days. So they're still going to be vulnerable for suicide when they leave the hospital, right? So of those people we gave ketamine infusion to, this is what happened. A little bouncing around of the data because the sample size was relatively small. But as you can see, pretty dramatic reduction in suicidal thinking within a day of, within just a few minutes of getting the ketamine infusion. We actually now have an NIH-supported study. Got to advance the slide. Okay. We're dead in the water here. Oh, there we go. All right. So as you can see, this is from another study that we're currently doing. Depression scores, just like with Carlos's data, depression scores get much, much better within 24 hours, relapse back over 14 days. But suicide scores get better within 30 minutes. So we can show pretty dramatic reduction in suicidal thinking within about 30 minutes of giving the ketamine infusion. Now, giving it once, relapsing back, that didn't help anybody, right? But if we can get the slide to advance, oops. Oh, I didn't, I did just simply failed to insert the slide. We actually have done both repeated dosing of IV ketamine and now more recently intranasal ketamine repeatedly, given twice a week. And we've been able to show that we can maintain the benefit indefinitely going forward. So so we can get people not suicidal within about 30 minutes, and we're able to preserve that effect long term. So in summary, suicide rates have been increasing over the last 20 years. The objective here is to get to the right treatment to the right person, because we know that that right treatment can reduce risk. But unfortunately, most people who commit suicide are not in treatment at the time that they actually do that. So we have to identify people more effectively. And so what we need is to use modern prediction algorithms to determine who's at risk so that we can actually intervene early and prevent them from ever committing suicide in the first place. And with that, let me stop and thank you for your attention.